Okay, I think we're ready to go. How was lunch? Good? Yeah? How's the event so far? You enjoying it? Perfect, yeah. How many of you went to SQL GLA previously? A couple of hands? So most of you here for the first time? Yeah, it's an excellent event. The speakers, volunteers, organizers are all doing a fantastic job, and I'm very happy to be here. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for choosing to attend my session here at Data Scotland. This is Pipelines and Packages Introduction to Azure Data Factory. And I know you've seen this slide before, but it is super important that we show this because without all of these sponsors and their support, we would not be able to be here today. How much did you pay to attend this event? Nothing? That's thanks to these guys for being here. So if you haven't talked to them already, please go and talk to them in the next break and just learn a little bit about the product, sign up for the mailing list, and just try and support them because they are supporting communities all over Scotland, the UK, Europe, and the rest of the world. So thank you to these sponsors. My name is Cathrine Wilhelmsen, or Cathrine Wilhelmsen, if that's easier to pronounce. I'm from Norway, and I work as a senior business intelligence consultant in a Norwegian company called Inmeta. I'm also a cloud evangelist there, which means that I get to go out and talk about fun things like Azure Data Factory. I tweet at Cathrine W, very active there, and I blog at cathrinew.net, so feel free to connect with me there if you want to. I'm also a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. That just means that I'm very active in the community. I love blogging and speaking and doing events like this, and they gave me a little award for that as a thank you. So all of you in here, I assume that you're working in kind of different areas. Some of you might be working more on the traditional business intelligence projects, or maybe data warehousing is your focus. Maybe you get to work with all the shiny new cool things like AI or data science or machine learning. And it doesn't really matter what you do or what kind of background you have, what kind of work you're doing. We all have one thing in common. Can you guess what that is? Data, yes. We all need data. And we all need to kind of do a lot of prep with that data before we can use it. So we need to collect it and store it, transform it, integrate things from different systems, or even prepare it for someone else to work with. And all of that is that's a big part of the job. Even if you're working with fancy machine learning projects, you spend most of your time doing this kind of work. And I'm assuming that at some point, someone got some kind of idea that, wouldn't it be nice to have some kind of data factory that could help us with this job? And that's where this session comes in. So 10 years ago, when I started working, it was basically just one tool that I used in my job, and that was SQL Server Integration Services, or SSIS. How many of you have worked with or work with SSIS? So most of you are familiar with that. Great. So SSIS was like the staple in the Microsoft BI world for many, many years, and then this cloud thing happened. So for SSIS, it looks something like this. You have a control flow, things like lookup, branching, copy data, and you can also have these data flows as well. So all familiar to all of you who have been working with SSIS. Very graphical, simple to use. And then there was something called Azure Data Factory version 1. How many of you tried that? A few hands? I'm sorry. Azure Data Factory v1 looked something like this, and it was basically a tool for orchestrating data movement. It was not an SSIS in the cloud product that they kind of tried to market it as, or that the community tried to market it as. It didn't really work like that. So Azure Data Factory v1, don't use it. Unless you have it already, don't even start using it because v2 is so much better. And that's where we are today. So today we have Azure Data Factory version 2, and that's going to be the main focus in this session. How many of you have seen or played with this already? Just a few hands. All right, so this is an introduction session. It might be something that you already know, but we'll get to a few other parts at the end of the session. So Azure Data Factory v2 looks very similar to SSIS, right? It has the same kind of look and feel, that graphical interface. You have the different flows in there. The only thing is, instead of an SSIS where it mostly went from top to bottom, here it's going from left to right. But same thing, different things like controlling and branching, and all the things that you kind of expect from a tool like this. So there are a lot of questions involved, though. If you're coming from the SSIS world and you hear about Azure Data Factory or even the cloud, Why should we switch, or even should we switch? Should we go from SSIS to Azure Data Factory? Should we stop developing in SSIS entirely? What should we do? So a lot of questions here that I hear all the time. And the good thing is the short answer is kind of, it depends on what you need. You can do whatever you want to do. So for Azure Data Factory, it is a hybrid data integration service. And hybrid data integration service is kind of the Microsoft spiel on that. That just means that it can connect to on-premises and cloud sources, SaaS applications, pretty much out of the box. And I think there's over 80 different connectors right now that you can connect to and very easily move data. And with that cloud-first mindset, it allows you to get all of that Azure data or even other cloud services like Amazon or Google very easily without having to do a lot of workarounds. So very different from SSIS, where it is an older tool, still a very powerful tool, but older tool. And if you do need to connect to some of those cloud sources, it's not that straightforward. And you can use it to build those complex and scalable pipelines. And it is scalable because it is in the cloud, obviously. You can scale it up and out as much as you want, as long as you have the money for it. And they also have data flows now, no-code ETL or ELT data flows, which we will get to later in this session. So what can you do inside of Azure Data Factory, though? There are kind of two parts to it, the way I see it. The first one is where Azure Data Factory v1 kind of started with the copy data mindset or ingest data. There are like 14 different names for that thing. The thing is you're moving data from one location to another. So that has been a staple in ADF since it was released, and that's kind of the core component in Azure Data Factory today as well. Then you have the other part of that, which is the data transformation, which wasn't there in Azure Data Factory v1. Now, you could tell Azure Data Factory to run other services, things like Spark jobs or something else to take care of that transformation. But now with the new data flows capabilities, you can actually do all of that inside of Azure Data Factory as well. So now you have that complete kind of the tool in the cloud that you can use. So inside of Azure Data Factory, the pipelines are kind of the core. That's where you do your job. And the pipeline are basically just a grouping of different activities. So activities are the specific things that you do. It can be things like copy data or execute a task in another location or run a data flow. Lots of different activities in there. And the one specific data activity that I want to call out are the data flows. So it works a little bit different than the other activities because they're not limited to being inside of one pipeline. So basically there's a many-to-many relationship there. So that's just one of the many activities that you can execute inside of Azure Data Factory, but it is kind of special. And when you do all of these activities, you do need to connect to your sources or to your services in some kind of way. And that's where the linked services come in. Linked services are kind of like connection strings or connection managers. So it's just telling you how to connect to a service, what kind of credentials to use, what kind of authentication mode to use. You do have to set that up. And then if you are working with copying data and not just executing an activity somewhere else, you do need to define your data sets. And a data set can basically represent a file or a folder of files, a table in a database, or anything similar to that. So it's just kind of a representation of the data that you are working with. And outside of the big pipeline scope, you also have triggers because you want to run these pipelines at some point. So you can debug them during development, and then you can add triggers to them to kind of schedule that execution at some point. And if you don't want to create all of these pipelines from scratch, there are also a ton of templates that you can use to start building your pipelines from. So you don't have to create everything from scratch. There are some great examples out there. You can also save your own templates if you're working in a larger organization, so other developers don't have to start from scratch either. So that's kind of the main Azure Data Factory world. And let's just hop over into Azure Data Factory and take a look at how that works. So I am going to hop into my Azure Data Factory UI, and I'll zoom in just a little bit for you here. So I'm directly inside of Azure Data Factory right now. So you can, if I can find my mouse, here we go. You can go directly to adf.azure.com to get into this user interface, or you can go through the Azure portal once you've created a data factory. Click on Author and Monitor, and it will take you into this view. Now what you see on the screen here is like the main development canvas. So this is your development tool. If you're used to working with Visual Studio as SDT, this is now your new tool in browser. And that is kind of a downside to cloud services as well. It's in your browser. So if you're not connected to the internet, you're not going to be able to get a whole lot of things done inside of this user interface. Now, behind the scenes inside of Azure Data Factory, everything is just JSON code. So if you know how to write JSON or edit that in some way, you can work directly on the JSON objects and write that if you want to. That is the approach that you would take if you want to script and automate the development of Azure Data Factory. But if you do like the UI, you do need an internet connection for that. So this is kind of the main canvas that you get to when you open up Azure Data Factory. If you are brand new to Azure Data Factory and you've never seen this before, you may want to go and explore kind of the Let's Get Started page. So on the side here, I can also expand this for you. You'll see 3 options. So the Data Factory Get Started page, the author view, and the monitor view. And on this page, they've actually done a fairly good job of guiding you through the entire experience. So this is an amazing tool for those who aren't traditionally data integration or data engineers professionally either. Business users can also come in and kind of figure out this stuff in a fairly short amount of time. So you have the main tasks here, things like create a pipeline or from a template, copy data, which again is kind of the core of Azure Data Factory, a few other things. And there are also a ton of videos that you can go and look at. And these are very specific little nuggets. I think they're between 5 and 10 minutes. Things like create dependent pipelines or build ETL pipelines collaboratively. All of these little videos that are kind of highlighting new features, and they add these videos fairly frequently. Lots of things here that you can go and look at. Now, if you prefer to read through stuff instead, they also have all of these different tutorials available that you can go and read. Things like lift and shift SSIS packages or transform data with Databricks. So it is very much a guided experience built to make it easy for you. And all the way at the bottom, you can learn more, you can look at the different resources and see the latest service updates. So this is kind of the main dashboard for ADF developers. So if we go back into the monitoring view, Dataflow debug session is still active, yay. So under factory resources, you can see here that I already have a Azure Data Factory here with quite a lot of pipelines and data sets already built. Once you open this up the first time, it's just gonna say 0, 0 in here. And this is where you can go in, you can click on the plus sign to add new resources. So if we click on that, you'll see I can add a new pipeline or a pipeline from template, dataset, data flow, and the special copy data wizard. So if we just start by looking at the different templates that you can have, let me zoom out just a little bit. You can see here that they have things like bulk copy from database to Azure Data Explorer, from database, all of these different templates that you can get started with, so you don't have to figure out the patterns and best practices from scratch. You can start with this, so it's very helpful to just go and look at how they've done this. For example, delta copy from database, a very common task. You don't even have to think about how to do that. Just open it up, read what's on there, connect to the link services and destination sources that you're using, and you're good to go. So very helpful there. Now, if you don't want to start from templates, you can start with the copy data wizard. And this is where I kind of recommend that most people start. So what you do here is very simple. On the left-hand side, you'll see the guided experience with the different steps. So define the properties, the source and the destination, some settings, and then you can deploy and run it immediately or on a schedule. So if that's the main task that you need to do, you can just go ahead and walk through this one. So in my case, if we look at a common scenario, if I want to grab a CSV file from a website and load that into my Azure Data Lake storage, in SSIS, that would be, kind of tricky. It's not straightforward to grab a file from a website. It's not really out of the box for that. In Azure Data Factory, it's super simple. So I'm just going to use all the default names here. You can see that it's using copy pipeline underscore CFQ, just a random little suffix there. I'm not going to change all of these now because you don't want to watch me type for 10 minutes. But if I walk through this, you can see that I have already created some of these linked services. So I have connections to my blob storage, to my Azure Data Lake, and to this HTTP Lego website. How many of you have played with Lego before? Few of you? All right, how many of you have seen like the AdventureWorks or Wide World Importers databases? Yeah, boring demos. I hate those demos. So I found some data sets that I like to work with, and that is on a website called Rebrickable. They have some files available that you can download here. So you can get all the different Lego sets, the Lego themes, information about all the different Lego bricks that you can have, the colors, and it makes it a little more fun to work with demos. So my goal here is basically to grab these CSV files. So the entire database is available to download and play with for free. So I want to grab all of these files, store that in my Azure Data Lake storage, and then use it from there to load into a database at some point. So if I want to do that, I have already set up my linked service to HTTP Lego. All that is basically just pointing to this Rebrickable website with the base URL, which is the URL for the files that I want to download. If you haven't set up this already, you can go ahead and click on a new connection, and you can see all the different connection types that you have available. Amazon, blob storage, MySQL, all the different connectors here. There are like 80 of these. And if you can name all of them, I'm very impressed. I can't remember half of them. So for now, we're going to use the HTTP Lego as the source. And then I need to specify the relative URL. So let's just do colors.csv for now. That's one of the files, and just leave everything else as default. Now what I can do here is I can specify the file format settings. So it's guessing maybe this is a JSON format, but I know that it's a text format. So if I change it to that, I get all of these little options here that I can go in and control. So you can set the column delimiter, things like the row delimiter, and all of these things that you may want to tweak for your sources. You can also click on this detect text format to have it kind of guess for you. And I can see here in the bottom pane that it didn't pick up that I have row headers in the first row. So if I just click on that and enable it, it now looks pretty good. And just from this interface, I can actually see the content of that file, which is currently just on a server. So it kind of read that file for me, and I can preview it without even having to download it, which is very cool. So once I have that, I need to set my destination, and I want to store that into Azure Data Lake storage. And I have this set up already, so I want to use the Lego folder, and it's currently empty. And I just want to give it the same name in my destination. On the dataset formats for this, the same thing. I'm just going to leave the defaults, but I do want to add the header to this file as well. And then on the next page here is something kind of interesting. So you can set the fault tolerance settings for the copy data activity. In this case here, it's going to default to abort on first incompatible row. So if you have some text files that, different columns, or you have the column delimiter inside of a column, how many of you have had those loads kind of fail on you for that? Yeah. So what you can do here is just out of the box, you can choose to skip those rows, or you can skip and log them. If you skip and log, it's going to be logged into a text file in blob storage, so you can go ahead and process that afterwards. Built in out of the box. It's lovely. So for now, just for demos, I'm going to choose skip incompatible rows because I just want to see how things work. And then we can review the settings. Again, I'm not going to change any dataset names or anything. We're just going to keep it for now. And what it does now is it creates those data sets for me. It creates the pipeline, and it actually goes ahead and deploys and runs that pipeline for me. So I can now choose to either go in and edit the pipeline or go into the monitoring view. So if I click on this one, it's going to take me into this third option on the left side here on the monitoring pane. And I can see that it ran this pipeline and it succeeded. And you can see all sorts of nice information in here with the run start, the duration, that it was triggered manually. I chose to run it right now. And you can also go in and click and see the view of the pipeline. So inside of this, I see the copy data activity, and I can go down here to these actions and click on the input, and that's where the JSON code kind of pops up. That's what's going on behind the scenes here. I can see the different source information, and I can go in and also look at things like how much data was read, how many files were read, how many rows were read, skipped, and so on. So all of this logging is kind of built into the product itself. And inside of the authoring pane again, I can now see in my pipelines that we have this pipeline. Same thing. So that's kind of an easy way to get started if you just want to copy data, have that wizard. You can even have other people kind of fill out all that information for you, and then you can go ahead and copy that data. So if I switch over to my Azure Storage Explorer and I refresh, I should have my colors file in here now. And that's very, very simple to do. It's an easy way to get started, and I now have a file available in just a few minutes. So the next step would obviously be, and this is kind of out of scope for this session, is you want to create either a pipeline for each of those files, or you want to create a dynamic pipeline. So I'm not going to walk you through that entire bit, but I can show you a pipeline that I've already set up. So inside of this is probably a pattern that you recognize. So you look up the configuration from some kind of table or a file where you specify which files you want to load, and then for each of those files you go ahead and copy it. It's a very common pattern, so you don't have to create one pipeline for each. So in this case here, the lookup, if I click on settings down here and preview data, you can just kind of see that this is a very simple configuration table. I've just listed all the different files that I want to load, and then we go ahead and load them. So if I click on debug here now, debug means that I'm actually running things, so it's going to grab those files and save it for me, but it's not going to monitor and log that information into that monitoring view that we saw earlier. It's just right here in this view, and you can see the output of that down in the output pane. So this is where you can kind of test your runs, you can test your pipelines and see if everything is working before you go ahead and trigger it. If you use the copy data wizard, it's just going to go ahead and run it immediately. So now that's going to run. It's going to load all of those files for me and put that into the Azure Data Lake storage for me. And in just a few minutes, I kind of have that ready to go for something else. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions on like the basics of Azure Data Factory? All good? Post-lunch coma? Excellent. All right, so I'm going to leave this running. It's going to take maybe a couple of minutes. And while we do that, I'm going to hop back over into my slide deck. So that's all well and good. Very simple to use, very simple to get started. Obviously, there are little bits and pieces that you need to read up on, and you need some hands-on experience to kind of get the feel for this. It's easy for me doing a demo that I've done a few times already, but it is very easy and intuitive to start using. What if you already have a big enterprise project, though? What if you already have, thousands of SSIS projects? You've all set up. You have a full team of developers, 10 years experience building this solution. What do you do then? You really don't want to start from scratch inside of Azure Data Factory. And if any of you have ever, heard of me previously, you may be but like last year, you told me to use this BIML thing to script and automate your SSIS development because it saves so much time. Like, did I just spend 3 years learning this different language and now I have to start from scratch again? And the good thing is, no, you don't have to do that. ADF also has support for SSIS lift and shift, which is great for those large projects that are already in progress. So lift and shift basically means that you're taking all your existing SSIS packages and you're just shifting them over to a different location. And in this case, the location is Azure. Very simple. So why would you want to do this, though? Why not just stay on premises? And the short answer is, if you just want to stay on premises, you're all set. You don't really need to be in this session. You just continue doing what you are doing today. But if you want to, start modernizing your data platform, if you want to start moving into Azure, or maybe you're seeing that you need to work with new sources, cloud sources, and SSIS is just kind of difficult to use for that, you can start modernizing that solution while already kind of retaining the investments. So if you have a team that is, they're familiar with SSMS and SSDT and BIML or things like that, you can still continue to do that. The only difference is that instead of deploying it on premises, you're deploying it into the cloud. So very simple. And then there's a little asterisk up there that you can see. One of Microsoft's sales points is like you can reduce maintenance and you can reduce cost. On maintenance, absolutely, you can kind of get rid of your existing hardware. You can use the cloud services. Much easier to kind of scale up and down by toggling a few settings in the Azure portal than having to submit a request to a company who is running your data center, right? So there are many things that you can do there. Costs, however, is a more complex question on that. And the short answer to that is it depends. So it really, really depends on what you do. There is a good chance that you can save money by migrating into Azure. It is easier to get started. You just, configure the settings in Azure and you're good to go. You don't have to wait for any hardware or any servers. But if you choose to use some patterns that are not optimized for running in Azure, it can get fairly expensive. So this is where all of you who are SSIS developers, you really need to be aware of this and you need to dig into the costs for running things in the cloud. Things like with SSIS, currently you could just deploy it. You can have something that's, it's constantly running. Every 5 seconds it's running, it's checking something. You can have things that are running for many hours because you didn't optimize something. As long as it works, it's fine because you already paid for the box. In Azure, you pay for everything you do, and you pay for every minute that things are running. So it's a very different mindset, and that's kind of the key takeaway in here. If you want to migrate to the cloud, you're not just automatically going to save money. You do need to think about the patterns that you're using for your data loading. And how do you do this? It's actually fairly simple. You can get started with this in just a few minutes, really. So the first thing you need to do is configure something called the Azure SSIS Integration Runtime, and I'll get back to that in just a minute. Once you have that set up inside of your Azure Data Factory, you can take your existing SSIS project and you just deploy it to that new SSIS DB database that's now located in Azure. So instead of having that on premises, you can do it in Azure. This does mean that you can only use the new project deployments. If you have the older package deployment, you do need to upgrade that first. And then finally, you need to orchestrate your SSIS packages in Azure Data Factory. So instead of using things like the SQL Server agent to execute your data loads, you run it through Azure Data Factory. You get that same thing with the monitoring and so on. So back to this Azure SSIS Integration Runtime. What is this thing really? It's Microsoft may probably have picked a better name for that, but that's the name they picked. So that is just a cluster of VMs that's dedicated to running SSIS. So instead of deploying it to your on-premises servers, you define a set of VMs in the cloud that is going to spin up and execute the SSIS packages for you. So it's kind of like having that little VM up in the cloud that you're running on. And that's where you can change things like the size, the number. You can scale up and out very easily. You just select a couple of different settings in there, and you can have something that's fairly small and fairly cheap to something that's going to cost you like 100 pounds an hour or something. You can scale it up massively if you need that. And that's, again, where you need to kind of go into that different mindset when going from SSIS to Azure Data Factory is how often do you need to run things? And most often in things like data warehousing projects or other types of projects, you may have just like 3 hours every night that you're running something. You don't want to leave your integration runtime up and running for 24 hours because that means you're paying for those 24 hours, even if no packages are actually running on it. So it's very important that if you choose to lift and shift your SSIS packages, that you make sure to have a process for managing cost by spinning up the runtime and starting that cluster of VMs, executing the things that you have, and then shutting it down afterwards. Ask me how I know that you should shut it down. It was maybe an incident where I did a demo and I told everyone, remember to shut this down. I didn't, and the next day my Azure was out of money, so I couldn't do any more demos that month. Yay, fun. So just keep that in mind. And to show you why this is important as well, going back into the Azure Data Factory UI, if I just close this one out for now, and if we click on New Pipeline from Template, there is a checkbox here on the side that says SSIS. If I click on this one, there is one template available for you. Schedule Azure Data Factory pipeline to start and stop the integration runtime just in time before and after. So they even have this pattern out there for you, basically telling you that you do need to remember to start and stop this when you execute your SSIS packages. And again, this is something that you may have to think about when you're running things, is you need to optimize your SSIS packages as well. If there's anything you can do to optimize the load, that's going to minimize the time that that integration runtime is up and running, and it's going to save you money. So you just need to go from it works, it's fine, to let's figure out how to optimize this. And one trick there could be if you are loading into an Azure SQL database, for example, is right before you execute that, maybe you want to scale up the database so you can load data into it faster and then scale it down or something. Or if you're using Azure SQL Data Warehouse, you definitely want to scale it up and then pause it afterwards. So there are a few things that you do need to be aware of if you want to lift and shift. Slightly different if you're working with on-premises sources though, but you may want to look into things like, are you running stored procedures or T-SQL scripts that you can optimize in some way? Is there anything else that you can do? I really, really don't want you to lose any money after attending my sessions, so just keep that in mind. So once we have that, we can, if we click on this, it's just going to say, choose this Azure integration runtime that you want to use. And I have already set one up for my SSIS cluster. And I can find that. I'm not going to create this pipeline right now. I am going to go down here to my connections. And then on this little tab here is slightly hidden. You can click on integration runtimes, and you can see this SSIS integration runtime that I've set up. So from here, you can do things like monitoring it. You can execute an SSIS package. That's where you go in and just pick a package to run. Right now, I don't have it started. I'm not going to start it. It's going to take about 5 minutes to start it. The only kind of takeaway you would get is, yes, you can run a package in Azure Data Factory. That's basically what you will see in a demo for that. But I can click on Edit and show you the different options that you have. And this is quite nice because right now, I don't think they did this in the start, but at the bottom there, you will see that they're actually showing you how much this is going to cost you. So it's right there in your face. And right now, I've chosen a very small VM for this. So this might be actually the smallest. If I scale this up to, let's do this one, 64 cores and however big this is, you can see that it's now going to cost me slightly more per hour. Then I can also choose between the standard and enterprise SQL Server licenses. So if I do use enterprise features, it's now going to cost me, so this is in US dollars, $36 per hour. And obviously, you need to do the math based on what your current setup is. How much are you paying for your servers? How much are you paying for maintenance, licenses, and so on? But you kind of need to go in and do the math on that to see, will I save money or not? Because it is an it depends kind of question. So what I recommend really is, actually, does it change if I set the number here? Yeah, there we go. Now we're talking. There. $353 per hour. That's kind of cheap for testing a few packages, right? It's not. So just be aware of that and make sure that you start with the lowest possible kind of nodes, the lowest possible VM. Scale up if you need it, unless you want to surprise someone with a nice, fun bill. So for that, what we have now is if I switch back into my, let's see, Visual Studio, I have an error message. So what I have here is basically just a very simple project right now that are taking those files, those Lego files that I previously loaded, and just running that into my Azure SQL database. So what I would do in here from this project, if I right-click and I say deploy, I can go through the process here of deploying to SSIS and Azure Data Factory. So right now I've set this up, I've created my integration runtime, that creates that SSIS DB that I will deploy to, and then I can go through the entire deployment process. And once I have that inside of, for example, SSMS, if I switch over to that, let's see, I have my SSIS DB right here. This is just an Azure database that I have. And then I also have the integration services catalog. Now this is unavailable right now because I haven't started my integration runtime. So I have to start that to be able to deploy my packages, to be able to see those packages and to execute those packages. So again, this is where you do the entire process that you're used to. You're developing, you're testing, you're debugging, just on your laptops, on your computers, locally. So I can do that right here. Let's see if this works or if I messed up some kind of demo. So if I start this one, everything now is just running locally. So this isn't going to cost me anything. But it's when I start to deploy that into the cloud and I start scheduling it, that's when kind of the money starts running. Make sense? So again, I don't really need to show you that you need to start and stop the integration runtime and that you can run it through Azure Data Factory, but I will show you what it looks like inside of Azure Data Factory if you want to execute this. So it ran, and if I just go back into my database, I just want to double check. I have my table here. I have data. Yay, so it works. It's basically just an SSIS package that you're all used to. Now back inside of here, inside of Azure Data Factory, I can create a pipeline to execute that package. And it's very simple. Under Activities, under General, you have this Execute SSIS Package task. You drag it onto the interface, and then you configure it. And once you start configuring that, you will kind of recognize the things that you have probably seen previously. Just some general things like the name, description, but under Settings is where you would go in and set up folder, project, package, environment. All the things that you're used to from the SSIS project configuration. So I can also, if I haven't started this one yet, so if I try and click on this, it's going to be empty because the integration runtime is not up and running. In that case, I can click on Manual Entries, and it's even informing me right here, do this manually because otherwise you do need to run the integration runtime. So if I know the package path, the environment path, I can set up all of these things and kind of get it up and running before you start an integration runtime. So in here, I would just type in the folder name, project name that I define when I deploy it into my SSIS DB. And once I have that, it's just a matter of, I can delete this one. So for this one here, it's pointing to a package already. Right now, it is informing me that it's not running. Once I started, I click debug or trigger, or it's triggered on a schedule, and it's just going to run that package and do the same thing. Does that make sense? Have any questions on that? So a few questions that I usually get when it comes to SSIS is, but what if I'm using some third-party components, for example? If I have invested in different tools, how can I do that? Is this just like, because it's in Azure, how can I do that? And you can customize that when you create the integration runtime. And I'm just going to discard these changes. So if I go in on integration runtimes and I click on new, if I click on lift and shift existing SSIS packages, I'm going to just skip this part, and I can't skip this one. Let's do this quickly. I just want to show you one thing. Use a password manager, by the way. Yeah, I do need to find. There we go. There we go. Oh, no, that failed. All right, there is a point after this. I'm not going to set this up right now. It does tell me, though, do you want to give some feedback why you're canceling this? So they do want to know why you don't want to spend your money. There is an option for you to choose to point to a blob storage container that contains the setup scripts. So you can create, it does require a few more steps, but you can add all of your executables, DLLs, whatever that you would install on an SSIS server. You can add that to a blob storage and just point to that. And then once that integration runtime starts running, it's going to go ahead and install all of these things. And again, that's why it's taking about 5 minutes to start it, because it's actually spinning up that cluster. It might take slightly longer if it's installing a lot of things. So once you do that, you can also use all of those third-party components that you would use on premises. So all of that is completely customizable, and there's also, you can connect this to your on-premises servers using a VNet, so they can talk to each other. So even if you're orchestrating things from your Azure Data Factory, it can talk to your on-premises servers and do all the things locally as well. So that just means that you can lift and shift and then basically just get rid of all the servers that you have on premises today. So it is completely customizable. And I don't think I have a link in this slide deck, but from SQL Bits earlier this year in February, the product manager for the SSIS in ADF team did a full session, a full 1-hour session just on configuring this, a deep dive into the settings and how it works. So if this is relevant to you, go ahead and watch that recording. There's a ton of useful information in there. Any questions on that? Yes?
Does it have to do the install every time it starts up, or does it?
Good question. I don't know. It might be that it installs it the first time and then kind of stores some configuration somewhere. I don't know the internals of that. But it does take a few minutes to spin it up anyway. Anything else? Yes?
Is there any costs other than the sort of running of the integration runtime? Is that the only cost, or is there a cost per transaction or something like that?
So when you're running SSIS packages, the only cost is for the integration runtime. So there's a cost per hour, regardless of whether you're running packages or not. That's just for paying for the VMs. There's also a small cost for the Azure SQL database where you host the SSIS DB database. And then if you're moving things in and out of Azure, there's some movement costs there. And then Azure Data Factory itself has a completely different pricing model. So in there, you're paying for how many activity runs you have, how much copy data activity. So if you're doing something on that on the side, there's a different pricing model. I do have a ton of slides with all the information on that kind of simplified. Simplified from Microsoft's examples, which are not always easy to interpret. So if you're interested in that, I'm happy to send that to you after the session as well. But basically, pay as you go, you pay for everything that you do inside of Azure Data Factory. So creating a task like this has like a tiny cost. So once you get to 50,000 things that you do in the interface, you might pay like 40 US dollar cents or something. All right, so that was SSIS packages. And just to kind of compare it, if you're used to SSIS, it's very similar in Azure Data Factory as well, but just a few different names on things. Like I said, linked service could be the same as the connection manager. Destinations are now called sinks. I'm assuming that's because like sinks and pipelines. Activities, control flow tasks, and then you have the data flows. And that kind of completes the entire story that we have once we get into the data flow part. So there's something called mapping data flows inside of Azure Data Factory, and it's still in public preview. I'm not entirely sure when it goes out of public preview. I'm hoping that by the end of the year, maybe. There's this tiny conference in the US called Microsoft Ignite that they usually announce things. So I don't know, but I'm hoping. So mapping data flows allows you to do all of that data transformation at scale. And this runs on Azure Databricks behind the scenes. It's a same thing, visual editor, no-code experience that looks something like this. So if you're used to SSIS or some kind of other tool, you can see that it's very similar to what you know there. A guided experience going from left, all your sources on the left, the different transformations and the steps, and then your sync on the right. And then you can have the different branches and things like that. It's a very visual way of seeing the data transformations. And again, if you already know things like Python or Spark and you enjoy doing coding, you can do that in Azure Databricks and just leave it at that. But I don't know anything about that, so this is useful for me because I can do things in that user interface very easily. And things that you would do, obviously, to transform data, so do things like branching and joining and integrating, derived columns, changing data types, all of that. There's also another thing in mapping data flow that is very powerful, at least to me. They have, thank you, built-in insert, update, delete, and upsert patterns. So if you're familiar with things like data warehousing, where you might want to upsert data, insert or update, depending on if it's new or updated data, instead of having to do all of that manually with scripts and stored procedures and kind of handling that, you check a box and then you define the logic for which rows go into that flow inside of the mapping data flow, and then you just say, upsert this data, and you're done. It's just like, for me, having built so many solutions by hand to solve these things, it's just like, whew, I wish I knew that 10 years ago. And then there's that last thing on handling schema drift. Schema drift, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, where your source files change for some reason. You can have new columns or columns remove, or column names have been renamed. Fun surprise getting to work one morning and everything blew up because the vendor changed some kind of column names, or even data types. And if you don't handle these things, it will cause problems upstream most likely. And I know I've spent a lot of time building robust solutions to handle these things. And how many of you have seen this error in SSIS? Yes? Needs new metadata? Yeah. So this was one of the reasons that I started using BIML for programming and automating SSIS packages, because I could just recreate the packages when needed, because SSIS was not very good at handling changing source files. And in ADF, previously as well, you could get the same kind of errors there that, the column doesn't exist or anything. Now, there are two things. One is how you can handle this inside of the mapping data flows, and the other is that I think it was last week, Azure Data Factory released an update to the copy activity setting that I will show you that kind of sort of rendered my entire demo and slide deck here useless because it can handle it, which was fun trying to figure that out. So I will show you two different ways, one with the mapping data flows and one without. You don't want to get to this. So you do need to know that if you want to handle schema drift inside of Azure Data Factory, it's kind of a upfront decision. You need to say that, yes, I want to be able to handle things. You do need to specify the different, it's called column patterns that you're working with instead of specific column names. And then you do lose things like early binding, because right now you're kind of working with the metadata and patterns instead of the specific columns. So if you don't need this, I would recommend that you don't enable it, just because that's easier to work with. But if you need it and you keep running into things where you need to do maintenance or fix things because of schema drift, then definitely look into this. So hopping back into Azure Data Factory, I'm going to close this out for now. I am going to show you, and I have many demos in here, by the way, so if you ever want to see any other type of demos, come and talk to me afterwards. If I want to now, like the final step, so we loaded all the files from the Lego web service into my Azure Data Lake storage. I just want to double check, by the way, if those were actually loaded. Yep, we have all our files in here. The next step is to load that from Data Lake storage into my database. And that's what this copy data activity does. So if I scroll down and I look at the source, so the source is my Azure Data Lake storage file for colors. And under sync, we just recently, last week, got this nice little option here that says auto create table on the destination. And if I hover over that, it says automatically create the sync table if not exists based on the source schema. So what this does is, if the table doesn't exist already in my Azure SQL database, it's going to read the metadata from my source file and create that table. So that was kind of the thing that schema drift could handle in mapping data flows. And I had this awesome demo that you can use mapping data flows to handle these things. And then boom, you get like one setting right here that just goes and recreates the table if necessary. So what this does, and just a final piece here if you're wondering what this is, so the pre-copy script is what's run before I actually load the data. So I do want to truncate my table before loading it. It's a very simple truncate and load pattern. But because I want to auto-create the table if it doesn't exist, I do need to check for existence, because it tries to run the pre-copy script before creating the table, which is slightly odd. So right now, if I zoomed out a bit too much. So back inside of my database, we now have, thank you. We now have all of our data loaded in here. What happens if I go ahead and I delete that table? Let's just delete it from here. Delete, check. Our Lego colors table is now gone. So if we now try to run the SSIS package, it's going to go boom. Like there's no table there. It's not going to work. If I try to run the copy data activity, let's hope I didn't mess up this demo. See what happens there. It's going to take a few seconds to run. Succeeded. that's kind of cool. So if we go back into our Explorer and we refresh the tables, Lego colors. It's right there. So it created the table for me. Now, obviously, you probably don't want to do this once everything is set up. But during development, can you imagine how much time you're saving not having to write all those create table statements? You just, here are my source files. Here are 20 of these source files. Just go and create the tables for me based on the definition. Now, the thing here, though, it's reading a text file. So all the data types right now are like the max strings that you have. And for ID columns, for example, you probably want to use something like ints, or for dates, date times or something like that. So if you're reading from a Oracle table into SQL Server, it can pick up the data types and it will create that for you. If you're reading from a text file, it's not going to understand that mapping out of the box. And that's where the mapping data flows come in. So inside of mapping data flows, let me show you this final piece here, actually this one. So this is a mapping data flow. I'll zoom in a little bit for you. So what I have here is very simple. I grab something from the source, I do a derived column, and then I sync it into my destination. You can do a lot of things in here, though. So things like create different branches, do joins, conditional splits, and if I scroll down, things like aggregations. It even has like pivot and unpivot with a graphical interface. I can never remember the syntax for that, so that's nice. Filter, sort, and so on. And this final bit down here on alter row is where you would do things like the Upsert pattern. Now, we don't have time to go into details of all of these, so for now I want to focus on the derived column. And what we have in here, I have to zoom out a little bit more again. Let's see. That's probably as good as it gets. So what you will see here now, this is kind of overwhelming the first time you see it. So what we have here on the top is where I create basically a static derived column. I want to add the load date to my table and just use the current timestamp for that. And then I'm working with the column patterns in here to change the data types. So for each column that matches, and I have an expression there that we'll quickly go through, I want to use the existing column name. That's the $. Again, this is kind of an expression language that you do need to get some hands-on experience, but I want to cast it as an integer. Same thing with if we do another type of column pattern, I want to cast it as a bool value. So for this first one here, again, this code is not the prettiest one, but I'm checking if my column name contains ID, or version, or quantity, or year, things that I know are int values. So that's kind of the pattern that I'm going for. You can also use things like the position. So if you know that the third column is always an integer, you can use that in there. Or even the data type, if it's coming from an Oracle database, you want to cast it into something else, you can do it specifically on the type. So very flexible, very, very versatile, but you do need to kind of dig into it. But all of this is very nicely documented. So if you hover over this, you'll see the little tooltips pop up there. Documentation online is great. So you just need to kind of figure out what you want to do and read up on how to do it. So once we have this, we're now basically just adding a column and then recasting the other types of columns. And if I want to run this data flow, there's no kind of run or debug button up here. I do need to add this to a pipeline. So if I go in here and I open up my specific pipeline, in here I've just parameterized this pipeline as well so I can run it for all the different files. If I click on debug, no, that's actually, it has to start this cluster, which is probably going to take a few minutes. So I thought that I had started it, but it timed out during my session. I hope, we have 6 minutes. Hopefully it will work. So once I click on this, it's going to run that. If we run out of time for this, again, this is the data flow debugging session that just needs to spin up. It is currently working up here. Once that is done, though, what will happen is it's going to run that data flow. It's going to recreate the destination table with the correct data types based on the names. So if my demo doesn't finish in time, just trust me, it works on my machine, what we do. So this Usually a data flow takes about 1 minute to run, so there is an overhead here. Also something that you do need to be aware of. So with the data flows, like I mentioned very briefly, it runs on Azure Databricks behind the scenes. So it needs to spin up that Databricks cluster. That's why I got that message that the debug cluster needs to start up. You do pay for the time that it's actually running as well. So there is an overhead of about 1 minute. So again, if you have those little, tiny things that takes you like half a second to do in SSIS, you do get that overhead with the mapping data flows. It's going to take at least 1 minute, probably. But again, that is just kind of what you have to pay for. So don't use this for like tiny, tiny little frequent batches because it might get very expensive. Use this for the big data, kind of big data loads, yeah. And that's the thing with Azure Data Factory in general as well. I just want to double check. This is going to run for probably about 6 minutes now. So for Azure Data Factory, the thing that I kind of try and explain to people is if you want to produce like one letter to someone or something, one piece of paper, you wouldn't build an entire factory for that, right? It just doesn't make sense. You just create that little letter. Same thing for all of this. Azure Data Factory is great for when you have those kind of big data pipelines, scale out, large scale, and kind of move that. So that is kind of the takeaway. All right, this is going to run, so trust me that it works. It's going to recreate the table with the right data types, and I can show you outside of the room afterwards. But for now, let's wrap up the session here today. So there are some lessons learned, and I've probably said this 1,000 times already. Everything has a price, and that is kind of the key takeaway here. Yes, you can lift and shift your SSIS packages to the cloud, but SSIS best practices might not be ADF best practices. Things like in SSIS where you would want to do like lots of different packages, you might want to try and retry it and do all of that. You may have to rethink those patterns if you want to lift and shift into Azure Data Factory. And in Azure Data Factory, again, if this is something interesting to you, I'm more than happy to have that conversation with you and guide you through the pricing, the estimates, how to figure out how to not get those unexpected bills. But it isn't as easy as just taking what you know and lifting it without considering the cost for that. And you do need to learn how to kind of learn and adapt. And the reason I'm saying that is because there are so many changes that are happening in Azure, like frequently. Power BI, updates all the time. The same thing with Azure Data Factory. The only difference is that the Azure Data Factory team aren't always as good as posting blogs and things when they release new features. Sometimes you just go into the interface and you're like, oh, there's a new checkbox that renders my demo useless, but hey, it's a good new feature. So you kind of have to need to learn how to follow up on that, how to make sure that you stay updated, which is why I'm showing you the dashboard where you can find all of those things. And you may need to kind of just go, okay, the patterns that I know might not be the right ones. Let's just try something new. So final thing here is basically just good luck. It is a lot of fun to work with Azure Data Factory, but you do need to kind of just get into it. Again, if you have any questions whatsoever on this, I will be outside for at least the break and probably at the next session as well. Email me, just let me know that you were in the session. If there are any other resources, I have a full day class on all of these things, so I could talk for 7 more hours if you want to. Email me, connect to me on LinkedIn or anything like that. Other than that, I hope it was interesting, and I hope you have a great rest of your day here at Data Scotland. Thank you.